everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the prophetic literature, and today we're going to be talking about 1 Samuel. And it's appropriate that we're here in Pittsburgh's PNC Park to do so, because the pirates remind me a little bit of a character that's present a lot in 1 Samuel, the Philistines. They're present more in 1 Samuel than in any other book. They're both seafaring, and they're both ferocious. But before we say anything further about the Philistines, let's look back at our outline that we saw in our last class. You can see 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel are the saga of Samuel, Saul, and David. We talked about how Saul's kingship takes up 8 chapters of narration time, and then twice that is spent on the transition from Saul to David. Let's look in a little greater detail at 1 Samuel. We can see in this first block, before Saul is made king, Samuel frames both sides of a war. Samuel talks about the word of the Lord. We see that Samuel is receptive and that Samuel functions as the judge of Israel, but ultimately he's unable to deter war between Israel and Philistia. So Saul comes in as king, but then Saul messes up and David is chosen to replace him, and there's a long saga of how that takes place. In today's class, we're going to look at a number of specific things that show up in 1 Samuel. We have 4 specific things. We're going to talk about the Philistines, then we're going to talk about Saul and Jonathan, this problematic father-son relationship, and how they both serve as foils for King David, who the book really is ultimately about. And then finally, we'll return to those lingering questions we like to ask. What message did 1 Samuel have when it was first committed to writing? And what was its role throughout Israel's history over the centuries? So now we're ready to talk about those Philistines. Remember from our last class, Philistia is this area southwest of the main part of the Holy Land. As we saw earlier, the Philistines are mentioned more in 1 Samuel by far than any other book of the Old Testament, and it's not even close. Indeed, you can look at this map from Verbum and see how 1 Samuel has the Philistines mentioned several different places, but it's not even throughout the book. There are certain hot spots on the map. I want to highlight 3 specific ones. The Philistines are the major antagonist in this early scene in that first main block of the book. Between 1 Samuel 4 and 6, the Philistines invade Israel and they take the ark hostage. This is when Samuel is a prophet and is also beginning to function as a judge. The Philistines attack Israel, which does not yet have a king, and they take the Ark of the Covenant hostage. And they end up placing it next to Dagon, their god, who ends up bowing down in honor of the Lord in what is one of the more humorous moments of the book. The Ark also gives the Philistines tumors, so they end up wanting to get rid of it and they give it back to Israel. Notice a couple of things that we hear about Israel's understanding of God's presence, though. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 3, the soldiers are saying, "Let us fetch the Ark of the Lord from Shiloh, that it may go into battle among us and save us from the grasp of our enemies." The Israelites are a little superstitious here. They seem to have this idea, oh, if we have the very presence of God with us, we cannot lose. And that was an understanding in the ancient Near East, that when one country's army won, that meant that their God won. The inspired author has different ideas here. The Philistines also appear in the middle of 1 Samuel, in chapter 13, a rather important chapter in the book because it's where Saul commits his first of 3 major errors as king of Israel, and it's where we meet for the first time Jonathan, the son of Saul and soon-to-be friend of David. It is when the Philistines attack that Jonathan first distinguishes himself in battle and establishes himself as a quiet hero within the book. What ends up happening with Jonathan, though, as we'll learn a little bit later, is that he has a conflict with his father. Jonathan is caught in the middle between the 2 main characters who are at odds with each other in the book, Saul and David. And then the Philistines show up again at the end of the book. It is only when the Philistines are threatening Israel, invading Israel, that Saul is killed, as tragically are his 3 sons, including Jonathan. So the Philistines, they're not flashy, but they do a lot of important things within the book. They're responsible for a lot of the animating action. So let's talk about our second topic, King Saul and his star-crossed son, Jonathan. We've already talked about how Saul commits 3 main errors, and this is very famous in 1 Samuel. We already talked about 1 Samuel 13, in which Samuel offers a sacrifice instead of waiting for Samuel to do it as he was commanded. The consequence of that is that he loses his dynasty. We're going to see 3 errors and then increasing consequences. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul fails to observe the terms of the ban in a war with the Amalekites. He didn't learn from Achan's example in Joshua, so Saul loses his kingship. Then finally, towards the end of the book, Saul consults the dead Samuel. Samuel had died 3 chapters earlier. He consults Samuel through a medium, the witch of Endor. for which Saul loses his life less than 24 hours later. That's pretty well known. One thing that's often overlooked, though, is the function of Jonathan in the story. Jonathan, as we already said, was introduced in 1 Samuel 13. But then in the next chapter, something interesting happens. Saul makes a rash oath. He says, if anybody tastes anything, let him be cursed. Well, Jonathan is the first one to taste something. He eats a little bit of honey. And so Jonathan replies upon hearing about this oath, "My father brings trouble to the land." How right he was. The inspired author delights us with a little bit of irony here. And indeed, this is what's going to happen the entire rest of the book. Jonathan is caught in the middle. He and David have a very close relationship. It's formed in chapter 18 and comes to its height in chapter 20. We're told 3 times in verse 17, and in his love for David, Jonathan renewed his oath to him because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan shows himself to be a man of integrity and a man who lives covenant love. Chesed is a major theme here in this section of 1 Samuel. But only 13 verses later, he is rejected by Saul, his father. David's love for Jonathan goes even beyond Jonathan's death. If I may escape into 2 Samuel for a moment, we have this beautiful poetry in the opening chapter of 2 Samuel where David says, "I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. Most dear have you been to me. More wondrous your love to me than the love of women." So this shows the really deep, brotherly, intimate friendship that David and Jonathan share, and how David is truly aggrieved by the death of King Saul and the death of Jonathan. And so now we're ready to discuss that most important character, that is King David. We can see that David takes up more than half of the entire first book of Samuel. David is the most important character. Indeed, his call at Bethlehem in chapter 16 forms the centerpiece of the entire book. And we can notice that there's going to be a refrain that repeats 3 times in this Saul-David cycle. The cycle where David is challenging Saul and ultimately will survive and succeed King Saul. This refrain first occurs in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 7, but then will repeat in chapter 21, verse 12, and chapter 29, verse 5. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. This little couplet is going to form the inciting incident for most of the plot line. Saul hears this in chapter 18, and it turns him against King David. In this cycle, the first block of it, at the beginning of chapter 16 all the way until the middle of chapter 18, Saul favors David. David is a military hero. He had defeated Goliath. But then Saul becomes jealous, and he begins to plot on David's life. But interestingly, Saul's hatred of David is not shared by his family. Not only does Jonathan befriend David in chapter 18 and then meeting that height in chapter 20, but David also marries Saul's daughter Michal. So David eventually has to flee Saul into Philistia, where the refrain repeats a second time. David is continuing to flee from Saul. In the third block, which goes from chapter 21 through chapter 29, David's going to have a couple of opportunities to kill Saul, but he says, "Who am I to lay a hand against the Lord's anointed?" So David comes across as a righteous figure. Meanwhile, the prophet Samuel dies, which sets the stage for the Witch of Endor incident in chapter 28. And so this final block forms the denouement of the cycle. David is relieved from fighting with the Philistines against Israel. David had been living in Philistia for a time. And then the Philistines invade Israel and kill Saul, Jonathan, and the rest of his family on Mount Gilboa, which ends the book. And that readies us for our final topic of the day. What point did 1 Samuel have when it was first written? And I suggest that there are 3 answers to that. First, to legitimize the Davidic dynasty and show the Lord's hand in bringing David to power. David had to fight for every moment of his life to even become king. Second, to confirm the crucial role of both priests and prophets in Israel, even alongside the king. We're going to see the importance of someone like Gad a little bit later on, and Abiathar, remember that name. And then finally, to reinforce the Deuteronomistic message of obedience to the covenant and collective punishment for disobedience. Poor Jonathan had to suffer even though it really wasn't his fault. We'll talk about more of these things later. Until then, read well and pray well.